Hello and welcome to our bookshop in Tring. I'm Ben Moorhouse. So we've got another author interview. We're very lucky to be talking to Helen Fry. It's actually our second interview we've done with Helen. Her first book that we spoke to her about was The Walls Have Ears. It was actually our first ever entry into our YouTube channel. And her new book is called MI9. It's a discussion. We've all heard of MI5 and MI6. Well, MI9 were involved in escapes during World War II and were formed, I believe, at the end of World War One. But fascinating topic. Helen's in conversation with Roger Moorhouse.
Lovely, thank you, Ben. Here we are again, Helen. You've written another book. How did this happen?
Well, don't be too impressed. I've been working on it and writing it over the last couple of years. It's just that I slipped another one in between, but it is basically based on over a decade of research.
Right, so lots of hard work's gone into it. Now, the subject is MI9. That's the title. A lot of us will be very familiar with MI6 and MI5. Not so much with MI9. So, what was it?
Yeah, so you don't see very much about MI9 these days. I mean, my book is the first history of MI9 for 40 years. And MI9 was responsible for escape and evasion of our personnel from behind enemy lines. So encouraging them to evade capture if they're shot down over enemy territory, or if they're in prisoner of war camps, then helping them to escape, to get back, to use their phrase, to fight another day. But also, if you think about airmen, for example, it takes 3 months to train an airman, and it's expensive, around £15,000 in those days. So we had to have air superiority over the German Air Force, over the Luftwaffe. So our pilots, were so valuable, we had to get them back.
So that's the origin of the idea. Was there a sort of precursor in the First World War doing similar things or not?
Yes, but it was very, very basic. It was part of MI1 then, and incredibly basic, and it didn't have the same philosophy. I mean, there are escape stories from the First World War. In fact, when MI9 was formed towards the end of 1939, they used some of the escape stories from the First World War to train personnel, as examples to personnel in the Second World War. But MI9 developed this whole concept of escape mindedness, and that underpinned everything that they did. And they also trained personnel, whether airmen, soldiers, commandos, whoever was going into action, had to attend a 3 to 4 week training course in escape and evasion. Because some of the stuff is quite basic, but you might not think about if you're disorientated in the moments that you've been shot down or you're captured behind enemy lines.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is an interesting point, because to us Brits, with our sort of slightly peculiar narrative of World War II and our view of ourselves, we, things like the Great Escape and Colditz and that sort of thing, this idea of particularly officers escaping from or trying to escape from wherever they were held, is kind of almost an integral sort of strand of our wartime identity in a way. Certainly looking back it is. But what that suggests, what you just said, is that this idea of escaping was something that almost had to be taught. It was something that had to be sort of trained and inculcated in the men. Is that fair?
I think it's true to say that you will always have, and we're talking about the men, okay, so you'll always have those men at this point who will, on their own initiative, seek to escape. But MI9 wanted to inculcate this into every mindset of personnel, and very basic stuff like how to blend into the background. And that might sound quite simple, but I give one example that I came across in the training manual, where an airman does escape, he's not named, and he cycles 400 kilometers across enemy occupied territory, but he cycles round a roundabout the wrong way, and a policeman spots him and thinks, oh, and of course he ends up back in a prisoner of war camp. And so it's little tiny things like that, and how to dress if you're in France, in a French way, get a beret, don't walk in a British way. So you could just imagine in the training all these British personnel learning how not to walk in a British way.
So
it's quite funny, actually.
So it's a practical aspect like you've just described, but also it's sort of almost training the idea that they should escape. Was that something that was particularly impressed upon officers and particularly airmen because of that sort of almost monetary value that they had?
Well, it's interesting that you focused on officers and airmen, because it was any rank.
Right.
Absolutely any rank was given training and encouraged to escape.
Right. So apart from that sort of training that they had before going into the field or before taking to the air, what other sort of aspects of escape and evasion did MI9 take care of? What did they help with?
Yeah, so looking at it from their angle, very early on, the War Office noticed a particular character who'd come for an interview, Christopher Clayton Hutton. He was known as Clutty. And because he thought outside the box, he was interested in escapology and illusionism and that kind of stuff, he was taken up, transferred to MI9. And MI9 had a role for him. And the challenge was to acquire, design, get companies on board to make tiny escape devices known as Q gadgets, and these are immortalized in Ian Fleming's novels. Of course, we think of those escape gadgets or any gadgets, exploding pens, whatever it is. Well, you find a lot of the stuff in MI9 files, and so Clayton Hutton's role was to try and smuggle these items in ordinary objects. And of course, they can't be too big. And that, when you scale down stuff, so one of his most famous things were the miniature compasses. And there were around 1.3 million of these across the wartime that were manufactured, and they were hidden behind buttons on the uniform. And you couldn't see it from the back. And of course, to access it, you had to unscrew it counterintuitively, so the Germans didn't find it. But little baby compasses were smuggled inside fake sweets, I don't know, walnuts, inside shaving brushes, you know, unscrew the end counterintuitively.
Yeah.
But fascinating stuff.
And this was a whole industry, this production of Q material.
Oh yeah, massive. I mean, we're talking about, you know, nearly 1 million of this, 7,000 actually, especially designed escape boots. They were quite well known in the early days. And this is where the boot could be sort of detached at the ankle and it would look like a civilian shoe. So if you're in civilian clothes in occupied territory, but your boots are going to give you away. So that was one of the clever things. And of course, playing cards, if they were slit open, would have an escape map printed inside. And of course, very famously also the escape maps themselves, which were printed on ink or tissue.
Yeah, that was something that struck me reading your book, was remarkable, the effort that was gone to generally, but particularly with regard to maps, because maps obviously are crucial, but how to get maps of a decent quality, but yet can be effectively concealed. So they're using sort of silk very often, but also, as you say, tissue paper. How on earth did that work?
Well, Clutty experimented, and Charles Fraser Smith was another character who was involved in this, in procuring this kind of stuff. The maps, copyright was given over by Bartholomew's in Scotland, which was quite helpful, so it didn't cost to buy the copyright of the maps. But Clutty experimented by adding pectin, which of course is added to jam to help thicken it. And he discovered that if you add that to the ink, it stops the ink from running. And if you look at an original MI9 escape map, what strikes you immediately is that this printing looks as though it's been done in the modern day. There is no smudging of the lines. It's incredibly tiny, incredibly fine, and as good as any map printed on ordinary paper. But of course, the silk meant it didn't rustle. You could hide it on personnel. And then the tissue maps were so thin and they could be folded up in very, very tiny way to be hidden inside, oh, I don't know, a domino piece or in a chess set. Which
would then be sent into the prisoner of war camps. Now, for us, those of us that are familiar with Ian Fleming's books, or Bond books, and Bond films rather, Q, of course, is the character that provides Bond with all of this similar sort of material. And yet, as you say, Q was actually the sort of process in real life, was the process and the department making all of this stuff. Is there a link? Well, I mean, what about Fleming, and was he in touch with the MI9 in any way? I know he was in naval intelligence, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. So Fleming was in naval intelligence. He was also in charge for the Admiralty of intelligence from German prisoners of war. So he was attached to two of MI9 sites, which are in Buckinghamshire, Latimer House and Wilton Park. Obviously had one aspect, one end of the site was involved in the whole bugging of German prisoners of war, but the other site was MI9's headquarters from the autumn of 1940. They moved out of London to Wilton Park, and Fleming, it's in the war diary, Fleming would visit MI9 headquarters. And so he's basically pinched MI9's bright ideas, I think, and fictionalized them. And everyone just thinks they're bonkers and they're great fun, but it's very close to reality.
Yeah, very interesting. Now, once you've got your captive prisoners in POW camps and they've been given their escape kits by various methods, then presumably they try to escape, and then it's down to these various escape lines to try and get them out. Can you explain how that worked and MI9's role in that as well?
Yeah, so for me, this was quite a learning curve, and I learnt the most from interviewing a surviving veteran in Brussels, Elsie Marshall, and she explained how this worked, because you can't tell from the MI9 files. Right. So there were a number of escape lines, if we talk about across Western Europe, and airmen and soldiers were told, or any personnel caught behind enemy lines, do not seek out anyone in the escape line. They will seek you. And that was one of the jobs which Elsie Marshall had. She was just 16 years old when she worked for the Comet line from Brussels, which went all the way down to the Pyrenees. And one of her jobs was, there's a downed airman in the woods 5 miles away, go and find him. So airmen and soldiers were supposed to hide. They could actually observe a farmhouse, for example, and if men were away fighting, the women were likely to be sympathetic. You couldn't be totally sure, but you had to stake out if you needed food. But by and large, you were not to compromise the lines in any way. You were just to wait for someone to find you. And that's where the helpers and the guides come in. And there were thousands of them across Western Europe, for example.
And then those escapers would be sort of passed on down the line and would eventually get to somewhere of comparative safety.
Yes, so you have the Comet line, as I mentioned, you have the Pat line, which ran from Marseille to the other end of the Pyrenees and out through San Sebastian. But yes, you had to get them down, often not the shortest routes, because the Germans were looking and they realised that escapes were going on. So they would often look for the short routes from the border to the seaports. And there were escapes through the seaports, but primarily these parcels, as they're known, were passed to different guides at different stages, right through Paris, which again is, I would have considered quite risky, but hiding them in plain sight almost, and then getting them down to the Pyrenees. And it's no mean feat to trek them over the Pyrenees. And again, they had to find really unusual routes.
And how did it work? That sort of works very, very well as you've described it for the Low Countries, occupied France, for example. But how did it work with prisoners in Germany when they, for example, the Great Escape from Sagan in Silesia, which is Eastern Germany? Is there any sort of support network there they can draw on, or are they on their own?
They're pretty much on their own. From my own research, I didn't discover any clandestine escape lines. That they were, Airey Neave is a point in case, the first officer to successfully escape from Colditz and make it back. He did it on his own. Actually, he was accompanied by a Dutch officer, Lutyens, but they made it to the Swiss border into neutral Switzerland, and then to the embassy or the legation, and then obviously had to wait to be repatriated. But to be repatriated, I was surprised they weren't just there until the end of the war, because that might have been safer. But to be repatriated, they were then passed down the lines back into Nazi-occupied France, down to the Pyrenees. So that's the way he came out. But pretty risky, and always the chance that they could be recaptured. And of course, Airey Neave's successful escape wasn't his first attempt.
Yeah. Tell us, Airey Neave's remarkable man. obviously known probably to people of our generation, particularly for his assassination in 1979. But his wartime story is absolutely remarkable and a very close connection to MI9. Can you tell us some more about him and that connection?
Yes, so what people don't really realise, and it was the same with the other giant of MI9, Jimmy Langley, with the evacuation of Dunkirk, Airey Neave and Jimmy Langley were with their respective regiments, and they were holding back, not single-handedly, but their regiments were holding back the German forces to enable the evacuations in the fishing vessels of some 300,000 personnel, the Dunkirk evacuation, but they were left behind. In fact, Langley was actually wounded and Neve also. So we don't realise that 50,000 of our personnel were trapped, didn't make it in that evacuation. And so Neve, for example, was taken prisoner of war and moved around at various points. And ultimately, because he escaped from one of the camps unsuccessfully, he found himself in Colditz. But when he made it back in 1942 from Colditz, there were huge celebrations because, you know, it proved that it was possible to escape. And MI9, well, from Colditz in particular, MI9 took him up, and already Jimmy Langley, who'd made it back from another place. They were quite central to MI9 thereafter.
And because of that experience that he'd already been a sort of serial escaper and had succeeded in getting out of Colditz.
Yes, and in the case of Jimmy Langley, he found himself having lunch with Claude Dancy, who was the deputy head of MI6, but also Dancy was in charge of the escape lines. And Langley, because he'd had to have his left arm amputated, wounded in action, once he made it back, he couldn't serve again in a fighting capacity. But MI9 thought, Dancy thought, he'll be really good. And what Jimmy Langley didn't realise was that his own father had worked for intelligence for Dancy in the First World War.
Right.
So I think Dancy had obviously when he heard that Jimmy Langley was back, thought, okay, I've got a job for him. And Neve and Langley went on to head the most top secret part of MI9, which I talk about in my book, known as Room 900.
And you mentioned MI6 there and Claude Dancy. What's one aspect I found very interesting about the book was this sort of interplay and the sort of constellation of power between MI6, between SOE as well, and MI9, and how the three sort of interacted, rivalries almost also between the three. Can you sort of explain that a bit? Because it wasn't always a very cozy relationship, was it?
No, and I think we tend to assume maybe that organisations and military intelligence, branches of military intelligence will cooperate, and they did in other parts of the war. But where you have MI9, MI6 and SOE, they're all operating behind enemy lines, SOE blowing up stuff and being very noisy. And of course, they were compromised badly in France. So Dancy was in charge of both MI9 and MI6 escape lines. He hated SOE, but in charge of the other two so that he could keep them separate, because he also didn't want MI9 operatives sort of, you know, too close to what MI6 was doing secretly behind enemy lines. So it's really to keep them separate. I mean, there are exceptions where SOE had to help MI9, as in the case of Holland and later in Greece. But by and large, there was a lot of rivalry, and there is the suggestion that Dancy may have compromised some of the lines to protect MI6. I mean, I don't know, it's quite controversial, but that's one of the possibilities. I mean, it's terrifying if that's the case, but
and you can understand why there would be that need to keep the various organizations separate, because obviously an MI6 operative court could then, if they were all interlinked, could then compromise the entire network of MI6 and MI9. So that makes sense, but that's quite shocking to imagine that MI9 might be compromised to save MI6.
Well, it comes in the character of Harold Cole, who's one of the worst traitors actually working out of France. I mean, he worked for MI9 initially, and he was passing airmen and soldiers to the escape lines, and the helpers would take them in their homes, shelter them, but they would also interview them and try and ascertain that things were genuine. Now already MI9 was warned from those behind enemy lines, were a bit suspicious of this guy Cole. And what it turns out was he was captured by the Abwehr, the German military service, secret service, and turned.
Yeah.
He was working for Dancy, and it's believed that Dancy turned him again to work for us.
Yeah.
And that he compromised by bringing fake airmen into the homes of some of those helpers with devastating consequences. I mean, people lost their lives for helping the Allies. So it's a very murky situation that's going on. It's unproven, but that's the current thinking.
Now, the Vatican seems to have played an important role, particularly in Italy. Can you explain that? That's an interesting angle.
Yeah, I think I've learned never to be surprised, as you probably know from your research, never to be surprised by what you find. And I discovered a small number of Foreign Office files, which are now declassified, which firmly place on record that the Vatican was helping MI9 in its escape lines in Italy. In Italy, we don't tend to look at very much, but terribly important because the later head of MI9, Sam Derry, had actually been in a prisoner of war camp in Italy. And as they were transferring a load of them to Germany, potentially to a concentration camp, we don't know, Derry, he's the James Bond of the story, he jumps off the moving train, injures himself, of course, but eventually makes his way to Rome and links up with a cardinal, he's not a cardinal, he's a Monsignor, Hugh O'Flaherty, this priest, and together they save over 4,000 Allied personnel in Italy.
Wow.
And when Derry's compromised, as you will have read, O'Flaherty smuggles him from the buildings just outside the Vatican there into the Vatican itself.
Yeah.
And they are running the escape line from the Vatican with money channeled from MI9 via the Vatican. The Vatican is a source of a money channel to save these prisoners. So it's quite something, I think.
It is.
When we consider the negative, legacy of the Vatican. It's always had a very bad press, but I think it's a little bit more complicated.
That's a point. It's an interesting counterpoint to this sort of the sort of dominant narrative, which is of Vatican sort of not necessarily complicity, but turning a blind eye to the Holocaust, for example. That sort of that dominant narrative. So it's an interesting counterpoint to that one. What sort of numbers are we talking about when we talk about MI9 escapers? How many airmen and soldiers got back?
Well, according to the official war diary, at the end of the war, we're talking about 35,000 personnel. 23,000 of them were actually escapers. So they've got 23,000 out of camps. The rest were evaders. But that's quite a significant legacy.
It is. And the vast majority of those would have had to rely on MI9 materials, knowledge, intelligence network, escape networks to get out. It must have been quite unusual for someone to escape entirely on their own, didn't it?
Yes, I mean, there are examples in the escape reports because when they came back, MI9 debriefed or interrogated them. So we have quite detailed escape accounts. And yes, some of them on their own initiative got out on their own, but they're a very small number.
Yeah.
But the vast majority were helped out by MI9. And, you just think if MI9 hadn't existed, what would have happened?
Yeah.
And of course, MI9 towards the end of the war was still concerned about those prisoners left in the camps. And you can read, as you know, about the plans to rescue those prisoners when they thought that with the war ending, Hitler might give orders for them all to be executed. So there was a real concern. But, I think that deeply humanitarian approach of MI9 to care for the personnel, and they were told in training, look, if you get captured, remember someone is still thinking of you and we will try to get you back. I mean, that must have been a huge morale boost.
Yeah. And what about the various sort of civilian helpers? What was their fate, and what sort of numbers are we talking about there? Do we know?
Numbers, it's in the thousands that we know from the files. We don't know really very much about individual helpers. There are just a few citations of awards at the end of the war, and MI9 tracked down all the helpers and guides to give them awards, but their files, the so-called helpers files, have not been declassified, and that's to protect their identities.
Right.
So we do know about some of them from Foote and Langley's book, for example, from Airey Neave's own work, and from the stuff that I've been able to find in declassified files, but that's really the area that will probably never be released in whatever theatre of war to protect those families.
Yeah. Now, what I find remarkable in a sort of more general sense in terms of looking at the historiography is, like I said earlier, this is kind of quite a central plank of how we Brits see our narrative of the war. You know, the Great Escape and Colditz and all of that, that looms quite large in our sort of narrative of ourselves. And yet there's been hardly anything on this. Like you said at the beginning, this is the first book on this for 40 years. The last proper study being MRD Foote's MI9 Escape and Evasion. Now, how do you explain that? Why has there been nothing else on this?
Yeah, I don't know. It could be. I mean, the files weren't declassified when Neve and Foote and Langley wrote their books. And I think they've just been forgotten.
Right.
I mean, historians have used individual escape reports for particular things that they're writing, but by and large, I think no one's really kind of realised that a history of MI9 was now possible. The very rarely is the MI9 war diary reference, but there's vital material in all of this to piece together.
Yeah.
And that's, I suppose that's why we've called it, isn't it? The forgotten secret service of the Second World War. And it was fundamental to the Great Escape, to Colditz and all the rest. And we love all those stories, but we don't realise that behind that is this top secret organisation.
Well, it's a fantastic piece of work, Helen. It's impeccably researched, wonderfully written, and genuinely new, which I always love. I sort of regurgitated, rehashed history always annoys me, and you certainly do not fall into that category, I must stress. So this is genuinely new. It's a real addition to our collective knowledge on this important subject. So it's fabulous book, and very much to be welcomed. So I wish you every success with it. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Massive thanks to Helen and to Roger for that lovely interview. So MI9 is available from Our Bookshop, along with all of Helen's other books. Do give us a call on 01442 827 653. And to that matter, Roger Moorhouse's books as well. So we've got a good selection of his. We've got loads more interviews to come, so do follow our YouTube channel, subscribe when you finish this, and we'll see you very soon.